Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation with renowned writer and notable climate change activist Amitav Ghosh. His latest book, called The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis, is about a genocide that was committed by the Dutch in the Banda Islands in the Indian Ocean in the 17th century in order to secure valuable spice, nutmeg. In his book, Amitav Ghosh also takes on the history of Western colonialism and draws a line from it to our current climate crisis. Amitav Ghosh is an award-winning novelist and essayist. In 2007, he was awarded India's highest civilian award, the Padma Shri. Again, his latest book is called The Nutmeg's Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. He joins us over Zoom. Amitav Ghosh, it is a great pleasure, sir, to welcome you to this radio program.
Hi, Mitch. It's great to be talking to you again, and thank you very much for having me.
Your book was mind-opening for me. I had never heard about what happened in the Banda Islands in the Indian Ocean in 1621, which there was a genocide. Before we get to the entire story, what is important for what you have written about to know about the Banda Islands?
Well, the most important thing to know is that the Banda Islands was the home of the nutmeg tree. Until the 18th century, every single nutmeg in the world originated from either the Banda Islands themselves or from the surrounding, it's a whole archipelago there, so there are some surrounding islands as well. But every single nutmeg, every shred of mace in the world came from this remote, really, really remote corner of the Indian Ocean, and the islands are tiny. I mean, the biggest one is only a couple of miles in length. So, it was strange. I mean, the nutmeg tree is really a sort of miraculous tree. It produces both nutmeg and mace. Mace is actually just the outer covering of the nutmeg. Yeah.
And what is mace used for?
It's a spice. It's a spice just as nutmeg is a spice, mace is also a spice. Actually, mace is a somewhat stronger spice than nutmeg, and it's used in a variety of things. I mean, as an aromatic. It's got a beautiful smell, taste. It also looks very interesting. Just shreds of red.
What's important to understand about this period of time is the value of spices themselves.
Yes, I mean, in this period, we're talking about the late Middle Ages and the early modern era. Spices were incredibly valuable, especially in Europe. I mean, a handful of nutmeg in the 16th century could buy you a house or a ship or something like that. Just a single handful. One of the reasons for this is that people, Elizabethan doctors, they put it about that nutmeg was a cure for the plague. And, at that point in time, Europe was going through these terrible plagues and so on. So that was a large part of it, I mean, there was there were beliefs about the properties of nutmeg and so on. But actually, at the end of the day, the reason that spices like nutmeg were really valued wasn't because of their uses. It was really just because they were like commodities. I mean, people wanted them because rich people had access to them. So they were like status symbols, So people just hankered after them, just like people hanker after Teslas or something, today. Yeah, that was what it was.
You write that this perfectly fits to Adam Smith's insight that wealth is something that is desired, not for the material satisfaction that it brings, but because it is precisely desired by other people.
Yes, that is actually what wealth ultimately is. And I think Adam Smith, he was a very clever man. And he understood this. Because wealth, at the end of the day, isn't just about how much you own or whatever. I mean, because there's only so many billions you can actually use. It's also about, for billionaires, it's about getting that yacht or whatever it is that they want. Yes, wealth is actually a pattern of desire generated by your interactions with others. To some great degree, wealth is also very closely related to envy.
Tell me about the Dutch in this period of time. I think we forget about the Dutch when we talk about European empires. We think of the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, Portuguese, but oftentimes we forget about the Dutch, which also had an important presence here in the United States, especially in the northeastern portion of the United States. Tell me about the Dutch during this period of time.
Well, the 17th century was really the period of Dutch dominance. The Dutch became a global empire. They displaced the Spanish. And one reason for that, really, is that the Dutch became very expert at handling wind power, doing big engineering projects, on their own lands and so on. But the Dutch became the dominant maritime power in the 17th century, and that process started in the late 16th century. So they really, because they were latecomers comparatively to the colonial game. What they did in the 17th century is that they systematically displaced the Portuguese and the Spanish across a lot of their Indian Ocean territories. So the Dutch were the main commodity that they were interested in at that point was spices, and although pepper from India was by weight the most important of the spices, nutmeg and cloves were the most important spices in terms of value. And both these spices actually grew in this region, which is now part of Indonesia. It's the far eastern part of Indonesia. It's called Maluku, but in those days it was it was known as the Moluccas or as the Spice Islands. So the Dutch made their way to the Banda Islands, and they were intent on securing a monopoly on the nutmeg trade. So they tried to force all these, various kinds of contracts and treaties upon the Bandanese, forcing them to trade only with the Dutch East India Company. But of course, the Bandanese had all sorts of business contacts. The trade in nutmegs had been going on for millenniums. So they had all these other sorts of business partners, and they couldn't just give them up. So the Bandanese resisted, and ultimately, literally within the Dutch arrived in the Bandas around about 1600, and in 1621, after several conflicts, the Jan Pietersen Koen, who was the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies at that point, he led a fleet. His whole idea, he went to the Banda Islands and told the people, okay, now pack up your things. We're going to just transport you away from these islands, from your homes, And of course, the Bandanese wouldn't go, So what Jan Koen did was that he basically eliminated the entire population. Several thousand were killed, many were enslaved, and the rest died of starvation and disease, And it's important and interesting to remember that the Banda Islands were one pole of the Dutch Empire at this point. The other pole was really right here in the northeast of North America. So New York, where I'm sitting right now, was New Amsterdam. Brooklyn, where I'm sitting at this moment, was Brooklyn. And around this. The entire region, there was the New Netherlands, So these were the two poles of the Dutch Empire. They also quickly became the two poles of the English East India Company's empire. But in fact, the history of European violence in the Americas had started long before that, and really, that violence was so extreme, that I think it was that pattern that the Dutch carried with them to the Banda Islands. A pattern in Northeast America, especially at that point in time, there were all these conflicts and wars where European settlers, were literally just massacring the populations and shoving them off their lands and so on. So I think it was this experience here in northeastern America, and also, the terrible violence that was unfolding then in Europe, during the 30 Years' War. It was those contexts that really made it possible for the Dutch to embark on this project of just creating a final solution, as it were, in the Banda Islands. Just literally eliminating the entire population.
Well, you write at the same time, or near the same time anyways, that this genocide occurs in the Banda Islands. The Dutch are also at war and doing something very similar to the Pequot Indians in Connecticut.
No, that wasn't the Dutch, actually. That was the English. They were English settlers. The Dutch, actually, at that point, were sort of allied with the Pequot. The Pequot were a tribe that were trading, in the Connecticut area. But it was the English settlers who launched on this Pequot War, and again, this was just a little later than the Banda Islands massacre. Again, the English just completely eliminated them, more or less. And they made it. They banned the very name Pequot. That was written into Connecticut law. Again, of course, just like a few Bandanese escaped, to other islands. Some Pequot, of course, did survive. And the descendants of the Pequot today are actually thriving, because they own some of the casinos in Connecticut and so on, and they've created museums, to introduce people to this history. But the history of the Pequot War is, absolutely bloody and just incredibly horrible. And we have long accounts of it left behind by the English who carried out these massacres. And weirdly, those genocidaires, as you might say, the people who perpetrated these massacres, they came to be greatly celebrated in the Northeast, and their names are memorialized all over the place to this day.
It's remarkable to think that they completely eliminated all the people. Either they enslaved them, removed them, or murdered the people of the Banda Islands. There was no one left after.
Well, some Bandanese managed to escape. The people from the surrounding islands came to tried to help them escape. So some actually escaped to surrounding islands, especially to an island called Kai, where they have villages that exist to this day, and they still celebrate their connections with the Bandas. Every year they have ceremonies and rituals. They go back to the Banda Islands. They sing songs about nutmegs. They tell stories about nutmegs. What is incredibly grotesque, actually, is that once the Dutch had gained control of the Banda Islands, they discovered that they couldn't actually grow nutmeg. They didn't know the techniques. So what they did is that they brought back enslaved Bandanese. They brought them back to the Banda Islands as slaves. These people had been a prosperous merchant community. They brought them back to their own land as slaves and made them cultivate nutmeg. We often talk about, the theft of intellectual property and the theft of technology and so on. But the scale at which this was conducted, by European colonial powers, in this period, it's actually staggering, absolutely staggering.
Is this a story that's well remembered in the region today?
Yes, among the Bandanese, it's certainly well remembered. It's very much memorialized on the island to this day. There are genocide memorials, there are memorials to the massacre, and so on. But outside the Banda Island, outside Indonesia, I think very few people know about what happened. And as you say, that's largely because people don't really remember the Dutch Empire, because all the archives are in Dutch and so on. The Dutch Empire tends to be forgotten, because also it hasn't left behind a sort of living legacy in the way that the Spanish Empire did, simply because the legacies of the Spanish Empire are, as it were, represented by the Spanish language in everywhere through the Americas. But the Dutch didn't quite leave that kind of legacy. And Dutch isn't really spoken very much. Very, very few people speak Dutch, even in Indonesia now. That entire history tends to be forgotten. But it's not like it's not completely not remembered. And, we must also say that the Dutch, to their credit, in the 19th century, actually remembered this history. They wrote books about it. So this history is certainly remembered in Holland. And, decades ago, they started taking down. Statues had been built to Jan Koen, who carried out this massacre. But decades ago, they started taking these statues down. So this whole business of, taking down these statues of colonial era conquerors and enslavers actually started long ago in Holland, and I think that is certainly, to their credit.
The way you got into the story is also pretty interesting and fascinating. And you came upon a count, and I may mess up the pronunciation of his name, Van der Chies or Van der Chis.
I think it's Van der Kais.
Van der Kais account, and it's in Dutch, and you don't speak Dutch, but you were able to figure it out through online translations.
Yes. What happened was that this story actually began with my going to the Banda Islands. It was a story literally where I was tutored by the land. I went to these islands and I learned from the land. But when I came, and that was in 2016. So, I was for a long time just thinking about this, thinking about so many other things as well. But when the pandemic started, I was here in my study in New York, and suddenly everything went, deathly quiet. I'm sure you went through the same experience over there, but New York was then the epicenter of the epicenter. And Brooklyn, where I live, was actually one of the worst affected areas in New York. Not far from my house, there's a hospital where, they had these refrigerated trucks, for casualties of the pandemic. So everything was suddenly very quiet all day long. We would just hear the ambulances sort of screaming past. It was a very strange, uncanny time. And I started, I started on this book, and I wanted to write about, what happened in that month, in those months between April and July in the Banda Islands. But I had only one. There's only one account in English, and it's a very, very slim account. I think it's only about 120 pages long or so, and only one chapter refers to this massacre. But I started looking at the sources cited there, and one of the sources, the principal source indeed, was Van der Kais' book. Van der Kais was a Dutch archivist in what was then called Batavia, which is now Jakarta. And he had access to all the 17th century sources. So he wrote a pretty comprehensive account of what actually happened there. So I thought, oh my God, if only I could read that book. So one day, just idly, I Googled the book on the internet, and lo and behold, a PDF turned up. And that was even more sort of frustrating, because here was this big printout on my desk, and I couldn't read it. So at a certain point, just looking through, I could tell that this is where the account of the massacre begins. And then, I called up this translation app, and I just started typing paragraphs into it. So first it was just paragraphs, and then it was pages. And I must say, it was kind of miraculous, how a picture began to emerge of this thing. Unfortunately, I also had some Dutch historian friends who helped. So that was how I managed to put the picture together.
You needed their help because, this is a document from the 17th century. Some of the words were much older or spelled differently than they are now. So
Yes, exactly. Well, the book was written in the late 19th century, but what makes the book very distinctive is that it quotes at length from the 17th century sources. So by the late 19th century, the Dutch were speaking modern Dutch, and all these translation apps are basically built for modern Dutch. So I noticed that when I typed in, some paragraphs, the translation more or less made sense, But when I translated the older passages, where this historian, Van der Kuys, was quoting from archival sources from the 17th century, it made no sense at all. So it struck me, because I've worked quite a lot with, archival sources. I knew then that the problem must be with the spellings, because, with the spellings and sometimes with the syntax, because if you look at 17th century English, there are big differences, thine and yours and, thou hast and, that kind of thing. So I knew that there must be some, those must be the discrepancies. So I wrote to my Dutch friends, and one of them, very kindly, a very great historian, he sent me, his name is Dirk Kolff. He's a great historian of the Dutch Empire, and of India and so on. So he sent me a list of concordances. And once I had the list of concordances, everything fell together. Suddenly, I started changing the spellings as I was putting them in, and then it made sense.
So you translated the whole book?
No, I translated in this way, 3 or 4 chapters.
Okay.
That was all. But they were the crucial chapters.
Still impressive.
Well, I had time.
A product of the pandemic, of course.
Yes.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with renowned writer, notable climate change activist, Amitav Ghosh. His latest book that we are in conversation about is called The Nutmeg's Curse: Parables for a Planet in Crisis. Let me ask you about that subtitle, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. How do you see this parable of what we talk about that happened in the Banda Islands in 1621 towards our world today, especially when it comes to the climate crisis?
Well, Mitch, first of all, let me say that I do not consider myself an activist, really. I don't lay claim to that. I've been thinking about these issues for a long time. But activism is something quite different, it's really organizing, it's being out there on the streets. And that is not feasible for me, really. Maybe if I'd been a lot younger at this point, I would have jumped into that. But, that's not what I do. I'm just sort of reflecting on these issues, And the big difference between the way that I see the present planetary crisis, and I don't think of it merely as being constituted solely of climate change, Margaret Atwood famously said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. And I think that's really true. I think all these things that we are living through right now, which is climate change, a migration crisis, and this pandemic, are all actually interrelated. And they're all aspects of the same thing. They're all caused, if you like, by the incredible acceleration we've seen over the last 30 years. This period that's called, in fact, the Great Acceleration, in everything, in modes of consumption, in modes of production, in emissions of greenhouse gases, So I think these are all results, actually, of the same set of phenomena. Now, so I see this planetary crisis, if you like, as being rooted in history, in certain patterns of history. This is where I sort of differ from most people who write about these subjects, because most of them actually write about this crisis in relation to the future, in relation to future impacts and so on. Whereas I see it as being very much rooted in the past. And that's why, I write about a whole range of phenomena, not just one part, not just one aspect of it, not just climate change, but a whole range of phenomena. Now, writing about it in this way requires, if you like, a different kind of form. You know, I mean, you can't just do it as a sort of a single linear narrative. You know, it calls for new kinds of forms, if you like. And that's why I use the term parable. You know, by parable, I don't actually mean anything like a biblical parable or anything like that. What I was trying to refer to is actually a parabolic structure, if you like, you know, not a linear structure, but a parabolic structure, which is how the book unfolds. And I think this is partly a result of the fact that what I am trying to do is to try to learn from landscapes, you know, not, if you like, from only from abstractions or only from books, but to actually try and understand what unfolded on the land. And in this, you know, there are people who've written in this fashion before. I certainly learned from the Swedish writer Sven Lindqvist, who wrote an amazingly brilliant book called Exterminate All the Brutes. You know, he was traveling across the Sahara and writing this book, which is, you know, the book revolves around the famous line from Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, you know, exterminate all the brutes. So Lindqvist's story is really about unpacking what lies behind this line. And it's a truly a wonderful and amazing book. And then there's another book that came out actually in early 2020 by an incredibly talented young writer called Ben Ehrenreich. You know, it's called Desert Notebooks. And again, Ben's book is actually about the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, and the deserts of that region. And what he does, again, is that he's trying to explore ideas and history through the medium of the landscape, if you like.
You also write that you were influenced from Native American writers about this.
Yes, very much so. You know, that became actually one of the great discoveries, you know, for me, discovering Native American thinkers and scholars like Vine Deloria, his son Philip Deloria, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who I think is one of the most brilliant, you know, thinkers and writers of our time. She's a Native American botanist. You know, this is the thing. I mean, Vine Deloria, really, his argument is literally this, that, you know, for Native Americans, space and land is the axis of being. You know, it's the primary axis of being. It's how you relate to your surroundings, how you relate to land and so on. You even think about time in terms of land, you know. Whereas for Europeans, for Westerners, really, time is the crucial axis. I mean, that's why their vision of history is always linked to notions of time. And, you know, time is not concrete in the way that space and land is concrete. You know, you actually have to inhabit a space. You don't inhabit time in quite the same way. So those ideas were absolutely fundamental to my thinking and indeed to my writing. And, you know, I owe a great debt to those thinkers.
How does that inform what you think about today and the crises that we are, especially when we get to land, something tangible? How does that inform your thinking today with the crises that we face?
It's completely fundamental because I think we now realize, the whole world now realizes, even at COP26, you know, they've enacted, you know, they've passed some sort of measure saying that indigenous peoples are the best guardians of the land. You know, they've set up a fund of, you know, it's actually a very meager fund, really, if you consider the scale of the problem, of 1.7 billion, I think it is. But everybody now recognizes that, not everybody, of course, but I think thoughtful people everywhere recognize that indigenous peoples were the best guardians of the land. You know, in opposition to the dominant conservationist tradition in America, which is actually very biased and very prejudiced against indigenous peoples, you know. So we see with a lot of what are now called these big green organizations, that they're rooted in a kind of thinking where, the land is regarded, land, forests, etc., environment, always regarded as being pristine, as a, by pristine, they mean untouched by human hands, as it were. But actually, there is no environment anywhere on Earth that is untouched by human hands, well, I suppose Antarctica, you could say, until the 19th century. But even the Amazon forest, we now know at one point it may have had a population of as much as 10 million people. And indeed, the indigenous peoples of Amazonia have been absolutely critical to the maintenance of this environment. Archaeologists and environmentalists now think that actually the indigenous peoples of the Amazon region were crucial to maintaining a balance within this region. So in many ways, the Amazon rainforest is really more like a garden than the so-called primeval forest that exclusivist conservationists used to dream about. And that's true of Central India. It's true of Africa. It's true of the rainforests in Africa and so on. Human beings play a very critical role, in maintaining these ecosystems. And increasingly, with this recognition has come the realization that we need to learn from the techniques of indigenous peoples. But there again, there's a problem. Now increasingly there's something called a TEK, which has become a kind of academic discipline almost. It's traditional ecological knowledge, and again, a lot of this discipline is really founded, if you like, on appropriating the knowledge of indigenous peoples. But I think what is not understood is that this is knowledge. This is not knowledge in the same sense that that we understand necessarily. This knowledge is actually fed and maintained and nourished by stories and songs. So it's we can't learn from indigenous peoples or anybody unless we also have stories and songs that nourish these forms of knowledge, these forms of engagement with the land.
One critique that you have for the Western world and the way that we see climate change is that we see it as a, I guess, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as my sense was as a technical problem.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you just, if you walk out of your studio and ask a random passerby, what is climate change? What are the solutions, etc.? The first thing that they'll say to you is, "Oh well, that's a technical thing. It's a scientific thing. Technologists and scientists know about it, and they're the ones who are dealing with it." If you ask the same question, in India or Indonesia or China or Africa or anywhere in the global South, for that matter, you'll get a completely different response. What people will say is that climate change is a problem created by the West, by affluent countries. Affluent countries got rich by extracting and exploiting our resources like nutmeg, at a moment in time when we were poor and weak. Now it's our turn. It's our turn to, become affluent in the same way that they're affluent. So, in outside the West, in the global South, this planetary crisis is seen as being geopolitical in every sense. It's seen as an issue, and that's completely rooted in global geopolitics and in global inequities.
That's interesting. Why we see in the West sees climate change as an issue and a problem for technology to address. The East sees it as an issue of inequality.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what actually makes these issues so intractable, because I think the whole planetary crisis is perceived in a completely different fashion depending on where you are.
So what is?
But let me say again that actually the whole discourse on climate change is sort of disproportionately influenced by the West. I mean, most climate science research comes out of the United States, England, Australia, Germany, and those countries have an outsized influence on the discourse. One of the really terrible things about this COP26 is that because of the pandemic and various measures around it, many delegates from the global south have not been able to attend. But also, the way that everything is being conducted there just excludes many grassroots participants. They're not able to get into the halls. In fact, they're just sitting in their hotel rooms. Watching everything on Zoom, just like you or me, for that matter.
I mean, when we think about the intractable nature of how we address a warming climate, and I heard you say this in another interview that I was listening to and preparing for our conversation, obviously, poorer nations around the world look at richer nations and say, you used all this energy and coal and whatever it may be in order to become wealthy. And now you want to cut everything off so that, what does that mean for us? And then on the other hand, you have a situation where, just look how our own intractable nature towards this issue, considering that we have an entire civilization here in the United States that's built around the car. Our cities are built around the cars. Our suburbs are built around the cars. Everything has been geared in the last 100 years towards the car.
Yes, it really is. It's really a tragedy, I think, in so many ways. America's love affair with cars is absolutely fundamental to its national identity. But even there are many roads not taken. Way back in 1910, there were electric cars, there were electric buses. We could have taken that road, way back then. But in fact, the fossil fuel industries became so powerful, and certainly, as you know, in California, that fossil fuel interests really didn't allow a widespread public transport systems, to take root. They actually pushed this automotive culture on Americans. But, that culture has really metastasized, I've just come back from a town called Ogden, Utah. It's not a very small town. I think it's got about 200,000 people or whatever. But just sort of going around the town, I could see that in quite modest neighborhoods, every house had like 3 or 4 cars and an RV, a giant RV and 3 or 4 cars. So, what's actually happened today, and I've seen this actually with even some families that I know, they just buy, after they buy their first car, then they buy the second, but they don't stop there. They buy a third, a fourth, a fifth, so that it's become okay, today I'm in the mood for my pink car. On tomorrow I'll be in the mood for such and such car. It's so strange. It's completely metastasized. It's become an end in itself. The car has become an end in itself. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I notice it quite often. I think many Americans now are actually more at home in their cars than anywhere else. You just see them sitting in the car for a long time, for very long periods, just sitting in the car because, that's where they feel most at home, where they feel maybe safest. I don't know. But the car has become an end in itself, And
it's fascinating to think, say 120 years ago, I don't know exact amount of time, but not that long ago in the scope of human history, there were no cars. And now we live in a civilization that's all based around the car. Yes,
and the really tragic thing is that Over the last 30 years, America has succeeded in persuading the whole world that the best way of life is the American way of life. So, and everyone now agrees. Middle class people in China, in Indonesia, in India are absolute converts to this point of view. So, similarly, you see this metastasizing of the car in China and India as well. I remember the first time I came to America, which is now a very long time ago, more than 30 years ago. I used to look around and see people driving. There'd be one person in the car, driving to work or wherever. And I would say to myself, this will never happen in India, because in India, even way back then, you would never see just one person in a car. There'd be like 3 or 4 people, traveling together, going here or there, because there was a kind of sociability around the car as well. But that's completely changed now. India's also completely adopted this pattern where, if you go to roads in Delhi or Bombay, it's the same thing. It's one person in a car.
Last weekend, I live in Oakland, California. And last weekend, after having a night with friends, and I was coming home, admittedly a little bit tipsy, but not out of control. Yeah. I was going along the sidewalk, and the sidewalk was uneven. And I'm like, what's going on? And I looked down, and there was actually old train tracks in the sidewalk. And it reminded me that Oakland, before the late 1940s, had a transit train system for local transportation. And it was the tire and car companies that bought not just Oakland's, what was called the Key system, but similar transit companies all over the country, bought them out just so they could destroy them. And that's how we end up actually getting a bus system in Oakland. And I was reminded by that when I said it was like an archaeologist finding, some skeletal bones in the sidewalk. But it's interesting how the history of the automobile in this country, and now we have to deal with the consequences. One last thing that you said in a recent interview I wanted to bring up, because I thought it was profound. You said about the West and our inability to do what we have to do towards climate change. We see what's happening in Washington, D.C. over the negotiations of the Build Back Better plan. You called, it seems as what we're doing is we're waiting for what would be called a Malthusian Adjustment, which was very profound. Malthusian is Thomas Malthus, an economist from the previous era, who talked about a collapse due to population.
I wouldn't say that we are all that everyone is waiting for it. I think this is the position on the right and the far right. There is a right-wing ecological position as well. It's known as ecofascism. And I think the dream that ecofascists nurture is exactly this, that, a lot of people will die. Most of these people will be black or brown or poor, and most of them will be in the global south. And after they die, people in the West will be able to carry on living, living large. So, there is that belief as well, I think, and it expresses itself in various unexpected ways. For example, with these. With these billionaires who are constantly talking about colonizing Mars, in essence, what they're really saying is that this huge disaster is coming, millions are going to die, and we are going to escape. So I think that's become a sort of silent subtext of a lot of the discourse. People just expect, this to happen. And it's in this sense, that we have to recognize that, the planetary crisis, and especially climate change, is a form of violence. Yesterday in Glasgow, the president of one of the Pacific Island nations actually said, this is tantamount to just bombing us. And he's right. This is actually the equivalent of war. It's an equivalent of war against the world's poor.
There's also a feeling out there that we're not going to be able to stop this climate change. and this is just going to have to play itself out?
Well, maybe there is. Maybe there is that feeling, but I feel that it's our duty to try and do what we can, to change things for the better.
Do you have any hope from this COP26 meeting that's happening in Scotland now?
Let me put it this way, that in as much as I think that there is hope in relation to the future, I think it's with the movements that are coming into being, most of them led by either young people or indigenous peoples, many of them led by women. I think there is a sort of great awakening, amongst young people around the world, everywhere in the world, because, young people know that this can't go on, that they are going to pay the price. It's what Greta Thunberg says all the time, So I think that is a cause for hope, because we do know that, once there is an awakening of this kind, things can change quite fast. But I don't think that it's politicians who are going to bring about this change. No.
But at some point, there has to be a political change, don't you think, for coal to be reduced, for all these things to happen?
Yes, but I think people have to sort of apply that pressure, and people have to take these deliberations out of the hands of politicians. I mean, the guy who's leading, who was appointed leader of the COP26, it's a guy called Anand Sharma. He has long connections with, he's a conservative politician. He has long connections with fossil fuel corporations, and the fossil fuel corporations have sent, over 100 delegates. They have a disproportionate influence on these deliberations. Whereas, how many grassroots people are represented? In as much environmentalism is represented at all in these deliberations, it tends to be big green, that gets represented. Grassroots organizations hardly find any representation. So, it's a completely, how shall I say, distorted. The whole game is fixed in so many ways.
Amitav Ghosh has been our guest. His latest book is called The Nutmeg's Curse: Parables for a Planet in Crisis. Amitav Ghosh, I thank you greatly for taking this time to join us today.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure talking to you.